Welcome to Over the Curb, the podcast dedicated to empowering truck dealerships and remarketing professionals. Hosted by Ethan Nadolson, a seasoned expert in inventory management, marketing, and used truck sales, and the CEO of SOAR. Tune in as we talk shop with industry leaders, dive into the challenges and opportunities of remarketing, and explore how to maximize your inventory's potential and get your trucks off the lot and over the curb.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Over the Curb. I'm Ethan Nadolson. I'll be your host today, and I'm very excited about this guest. Read a book that she wrote, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Megan Gerhardt, and she is the professor of management and leadership at Miami University's Farmer School of Business, and the author of a book called Gentelligence. This revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce is the whole name of the game for this book. Megan's also a leadership consultant, speaker, and she's been featured in the Harvard Business Review, the Washington Post, Fast Company, Forbes, and I'd like to say most notably, she was my daughter's professor at Miami. And so I'm repping a little bit here today. And I just want to say, Megan, I'm very honored and excited to have you on. You were her favorite professor, and it's just an honor to have you on today.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So I'm excited about this topic because my business is multi-generational, has been multi-generational, all the way from boomer to Gen X to millennials, and we've even got one Gen Z coming up. So pretty excited about that. So can you tell us a little bit about your book and really what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. So the book actually came out in 2021. It was co-authored with two former students of mine. So really, you cannot write a book about the power of generational differences in the workplace by yourself. That would be sort of hypocritical, I decided. So I had two fantastic former students who were out in the workplace that I really enjoyed working with. And originally, the thought was they would kind of be contributors to the book, provide maybe the millennial perspective to some of the things I was writing about. But as the process went on, they were so valuable to the content and just the development of what we were saying that we became co-authors. So that's kind of an interesting difference, I think, about the book. And what brought me to write it was I've been working in this space for a long time, probably it's over 15 years now. The story I always tell is that I began my career at Miami University, where I still am today, when I was pretty young. I was 26, meaning that I really was closer in age to my students than most of my colleagues. And that was a really interesting dynamic for me. I think it could have been really awkward, but I found it really fascinating. It was interesting to see how in the courses I was teaching, which are things like leadership and change management, we were already seeing some really fascinating differences between like my generation when I had been their age and the generation coming right after me. So that would have been the millennials. And I thought that was really something to dig into. I thought it was valuable and interesting. And then compared to my colleagues who were anywhere from, 10 to 40 years older than me when I started, definitely big differences and some similarities. And I really just wanted to look at that from all angles, research angle in the classroom. I started being asked to speak different places about it. And I realized that really what was happening is most people were at most getting sort of this stereotypical generic generational training when they were getting someone to come in and speak on it. Those, cookie cutter lazy slides that have the name of your generation and the years and the three things that happened to your generation. And therefore, this is how everyone in your generation thinks and behaves, which we all know is not accurate. I think everyone who looks at that, disengages and thinks, well, this is silly. Just the same way you would if any kind of, difference you had was represented on one slide, we would never say like all men think this way, right? We would know that was silly. But that was really the best we were getting when it came to really exploring generations. And honestly, that's probably 80 to 90% of what we get now. And so I really wanted to change that. We know a lot about how to explore people's differences in a way that's a lot smarter, that helps us see them as an opportunity instead of something that is threatening or unfortunate. And so I wanted to try to bring a different lens to this generational conversation. So that's what led to the book and all the things that have come after it.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that's both going backwards and uh, down, I guess, in the in the generations, right? So there's generational stigma about millennials or Z or boomers. Like, you even mentioned the phrase that I think, many people have heard, okay, boomer, kind of rhetoric that's out there. And you've even pointed out that a lot of media has picked that up and run
Oh,
with it. So easy
yeah.
fodder, I guess. But
Yeah, and I think that's where most of it starts. There's this generational shaming norm in the media. Most of those headlines are very clickbait, and it's a great narrative to put out there that somehow generations are involved in a war, and people click on the Gen Z has killed whatever they've killed, avocados or something, and
yeah,
whatever it is, it's very easy to point fingers and blame. I always say if something's changing too fast, then we blame the younger generation. If it's not changing fast enough, we blame the older generation, and that's been true when we were researching the book. We found quotes going all the way back to like Plato talking about, what's wrong with these kids? They're never going to make it. It's not a new narrative or issue. And so my point has been, if we're going to keep addressing it in the same way, it's never going to get any better. So we need to find a smarter way to think about it and hopefully understand there's this great potential. There's certainly a lot of challenges. I'm not going to pretend that there's not, but that's true whenever you're working with people who might, be in some way different in terms of their norms or their perspectives. But then they're on the other side of that. If you can get there, is all of this great opportunity.
yeah, for sure. And I think you brought up a couple things in that is number one, you're talking about Plato, and he was not in the United States. So a lot of times when even I have thought about generations, which maybe I just haven't thought of deep enough at any point in time. I know, we've had some demographers and different people like that I've had the opportunity to listen to speak. But once you start looking at the global uh, just diversity that we have and all of the different countries, there's just different generations and different generational attitudes in those countries as well.
Right. And so one of the things I love to say when I speak is I like to start with, of course, sort of pointing out really clearly that we're not here to be putting people in boxes, that's not productive. It's not really what we're interested in. But also that generation is one layer of who you are, one layer of your identity. I think it's very fascinating, right? The point in time in history you were born and grew up, it does matter. It doesn't mean everyone grew up in the exact same way, that we've all been affected by the big formative events of our childhood in the same way. That's kind of where that all goes in the ditch.
Mhm.
But we do know, there's research showing that these formative events that happen socially or culturally or economically when you're young, they do have a disproportionate effect on the way you think and behave compared to it happening to you when you were older, right? So I always say, like, the pandemic affected all of us, but those who were in that sort of 5 to 25-year-old time window when they were in school, their brains were forming, they were having their first work experience, like having a global pandemic and lockdown happen at that point in their development makes it much more likely that it will have a profound effect on the way they view things like health and work and all of those important things. And so you kind of take that out to the idea that generation is one layer of who you are that affects your perspective and your life experience, but there's so many others. So as you pointed out, like where you grew up in the world, if you were in China or you were in Australia or you were in Africa or France, right, you would have a different conceptualization of age. So in some cultures, age is revered. The older you are, the more respected you are. They take care of their elderly relatives, when they no longer can take care of themselves versus, the more Western idea of maybe we don't necessarily view age that way all the time. And then even like one of my co-authors of the book is from Sweden. And I asked her, I said, are the generational categories the same in Sweden? And she said, we don't really have generations. We look at like the decade someone was born sort of as an interesting reference. And so those are all sort of social formations, right? We sort of say this was a generation in our society because of these big things happening at the time that we think brought them sort of together in some ways, but it's very complex. And I think that makes it more interesting. I always say generation can be the beginning of the conversation, but it shouldn't be the end of the conversation. So if, I know like you were talking about in your industry, like that's also a really interesting layer, right? What did it mean to grow up in the time in history you did and then start working in this industry at that particular time? That would be different than somebody who started working in it 50 years before or after, right? That would be a different experience in that field. So I think we want to try to include as much of that as possible in the conversation.
Yeah. And in our industry, I think that's even, I think everything right now, COVID definitely affected many things, technologically pushed a lot of things forward, but also kind of how we interact with others in our industry. There's all kind of emissions that have been going on, emissions regulations that have been going on for the last, 20 years, something like that. And that's forced the engine manufacturers and the truck manufacturers to have to put new technology into trucks to make them cleaner as they're driving down the road, diesel particulate filters and other devices like that have been added to the trucks. So, and it's changed the game. The internet's changed the game. I know, like when I was growing up, my dad sold trucks, and I'd go out and climb around trucks and hang out at the dealership and all that. And customers would come in and they'd talk to you, but now it's a lot more. They've researched it online, and now they're coming in just like everything. Now they're coming in, so it's in a way, and in certain parts of the market anyway, it's commoditized the industry a little bit, and some of it very much so. So we just see some differences even in the style of sales, and then also the customer's expectations, and some of the, I'm going to call them the old guard, have adapted to those ways. Some of them have not, and they're just kind of riding out their time saying, yeah, I'm kind of scared of this technology stuff, and I really don't know what to do with it. But as this younger generation's coming up, they're starting to embrace it. But to your point, Megan, it's not all or nothing on either side. There are definitely people that are in the maybe boomer generation that have embraced it, and in the millennials that are coming up and really starting to take ownership of the industry. There's a lot of questions being asked on how they do things. So I think it's pretty interesting. But there are still some generational tensions in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you talked extensively about it in the book and how some of that works, and maybe the different. You had 4 different ways that you kind of approach that. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. There's definitely, I think most of us, if we were asked, even the phrase like generational differences tends to have a pretty negative connotation, in part because of the media, but also, most of us, we have had frustration, and that's very real. The research supports without a strategy, without proactive effort, you probably are going to have generational tension. And actually, an age diverse workforce is not more productive, more innovative, more engaging, just without any kind of leadership or management strategy. So if we just kind of let people fend for themselves, it is more frustrating than working with people similar in age. That's just the reality, because people similar in age tend to share norms about this is how you do X, right? And that is a product of all the things we've already talked about. And I love generational norms. as a phrase because we're not stereotyping. I'm not insisting that everybody who's a Gen Xer does it this way. That's silly. But I'm saying in my generation, which does happen to be Gen X, the norm for doing something a particular way was higher or lower than we saw it in my parents' or my kids' generation, right? And that is what we feel and experience in the workplace are those norms. And by talking about those, it allows us sort of to relax about the fact that, no, I'm not insisting every person born in this 15-year period is exactly the same. I'm saying there's certainly a frequency difference in how often someone does this or thinks this is correct versus a different way. So you get this norm clash. And industry-wise, we see this in every industry. I've worked, everything from tech to fast food to professional sports to, you name it. I've done consulting in that industry. Healthcare is a huge one right now. As you said, construction, the skilled trades, all of these things, there is a way you learn is the way to do something, whether this is how you become successful. I mean, there's a whole story I know that you and I want to get into around why, we have this gap in the talent pipeline in skilled trades. My husband's a contractor and a carpenter. And so he's my age, he's 48, and often one of the youngest people on a job site because we didn't encourage people in Gen X or in the millennial generation to go into those professions the way that was a norm prior to that. So there's a lot of reasons why. The baby boomer generation was charged with creating more success for their generation and future generations of their family because of, coming off of World War II and the Depression and all of those things. And many baby boomers said to their kids, you need to go to college or you need to go to graduate school or you don't want to have to work with your hands your whole life. Even if someone did want to work with their hands their whole life, the norm was, well, that's very hard and it's going to be hard on you and it's going to be a tough life. So it would be, quote, better if you went to college and, that was considered the new norm of like what success would look like.
Yeah.
And what happened was, I work at a university. So I think that was great for some people. Like it's great that it became in some ways more accessible. And then of course it got too expensive. And that's a whole other podcast episode about the cost of higher ed. But I think unfortunately what it also did is the people who are very talented in, the ways we need, working with their hands or mechanically inclined or all of those other kinds of talents were sort of told that, oh, you don't want to go do that. In fact, here's, all of these industries where not only do we desperately need people who are able to do those things, we ended up not getting the level of talent we needed because people weren't encouraged to do that. And there's a lot of people that shouldn't go to college. It's not what they're interested in. It's not their lane. They don't want to do what it would be preparing them to do. And I think we missed out on a lot of those people entering into these really important professions. Now, fortunately, we're seeing that come around again, which everything does generationally. But now we're seeing Gen Z. So Gen Zs this year are anywhere from 13 to 28 years old. So that's a pretty wide range. But we're seeing more and more Gen Zs who are interested in skilled trades, in part because they're seeing all the student loan debt that the millennials compiled and thinking, well, that doesn't seem like a good choice. Or they're seeing people who put a lot into going to school and didn't end up getting the job they thought they would get or wanted to get. And here we've had a lot of the skilled trades putting effort into recruiting and educating younger people about the opportunities that might be in these different professions. So, the technical colleges, the trade schools, my son has people his age who trained to be a firefighter. His best friend trained to be a firefighter right out of high school. My son's starting an airplane mechanic tech program Um, because it's like you could make a great living. You can be working with your hands. You can be your own boss. You can be all of these things that appeal to a lot of young people. So I think we're seeing that norm shift. The mean age, as you know, in skilled trades is so much higher than it is in other fields, and now we have this pipeline gap. So that's good. I think that we're now seeing that norm shift. But also, as you said with the tension, I know you asked me to come up, go talk about the practices, and I promise I will. I got off on
No,
that
this is
tangent.
good stuff. Yeah.
But I think the tension comes anytime there's sort of a my way versus your way. And before I talk about the way we navigate that, I think, we can think about either I'm biased and I'm assuming that everybody your age is blank. That's obviously a big problem. Or I feel somewhat threatened, either as an older or younger person, because somehow your way of doing it is implying my way of doing it, whatever it is, isn't right or isn't as effective or isn't as smart, right? And unfortunately, what we get is this tug of war where it's either going to be your way or my way instead of where we need to get, which is, well, how could your way and my way be blended together to come up with something even better?
Yeah.
But our egos get in the way. I think threat gets in the way. And so that's a lot of the tension. And in the book, we dig into it in a lot of ways. We talk about different kinds of knowledge, right? It might be that your youngest employees have all kinds of new ideas or technology or systems or processes or things they think would be huge improvements. And that could very well be true. That is what is sometimes called, know what or know how, right? I have a new way to do this. But what older generations often have is the know when or the know why. So we talk a lot about like, well, when would be the right time to make that move? Not at the end of the year when we're trying to clear inventory, or not
Yeah.
when we're trying to, we don't have budget for a new whatever it is at this point. Like the things that you learn over time are different than sort of that like brand new, like I have a great idea. Well, how do we execute it? How do we make sure other people will get on board with it? Those are different kinds of expertise
Yep.
that are sitting in all of that kind of generational knowledge. So I think, the tension often just comes from the judgment we cast on something that isn't the way that makes sense to me. And that does happen, as you said, older to younger and younger to older. It's not reserved for one. It's any time we see difference. So I think that's where the tension comes from. I'll pause in case you want to I've been talking a lot, but then I'm happy to talk about like, what do we actually do about it is the $1 million question.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're doing great. I'm soaking it all in. I think this is a great conversation, and I think one of the things you're talking about that I see is as long as they understand the why behind the business, and that's a whole Simon Sinek kind of conversation we could get into, talking about the why that you're doing the business, whatever it is that you're doing, and passing that down to generations. I think I've seen a lot of businesses and different things fail because they just don't understand why. Well, this is why we do what we do. And you brought that up very well in the last couple of chapters of your book, talking about this is who we are. This is our identity, and making sure that they understand the identity of your brand and of your product, and communicating that clearly. And you had some great examples, and I don't want to talk about all of them because I want people to actually read the book and go through it. But some really, really great stuff there. So yeah, and that leads us into, so what are the strategies that you can recommend to, first of all, overcome some of those generational gaps? How do I change my mindset? How do I change, if somebody is looking at another generation and they're having trouble with it, how do they get past that? And then I'm really interested to jump into some strategies on the sales side here in a minute, but let's hit this first and talk about the Gentelligence practices.
Yeah. So I think I'll bring in a metaphor that's not in the book, but I think you'll like it. I try to tell people Think about your organization. So that can be your company, your industry, however you want to frame it. Think of it as a house, right? That's your house. And the youngest generation, whatever it is, it's Gen Z right now, but it will be Gen Alpha after that, and there'll be more coming after that. When they come in the house, they're going to shake the walls. That's what young people do. They're going to kick at the walls, shake the walls. Why is this wall here? Is this an important wall? That's part of being young, and there's a tension there, but also an opportunity. So I say when that happens, some of the walls they're gonna shake are load bearing walls, right? My husband's a carpenter, so I feel good about this analogy. There's load bearing walls, as you said. It's like, nope, that one's part of who we are. That's core to our industry. That's core to our family business. That's our values, our mission. It's really important. And even though you don't understand it, or maybe you don't like it, or whatever it is, that wall's not going anywhere. So there's a misperception that we have to just keep changing everything because younger people would like it to be a different way. And I push back on that a lot. So when your younger employees push on load bearing walls, from a leadership perspective, we can't be defensive. And part of the tension there comes from previously, younger generations were not pushing back the same ways. I think we've always pushed back, but we were much less forward and vocal because the norm was like, oh, it's not your place, or you, even if something doesn't make sense or isn't working well, that's above my pay grade, or I'll have to wait till I'm in charge to change that. Well, as we get into quite a bit in the book, younger generations were raised with a much stronger sense of voice in many families, not all, but many, particularly in the US, meaning their needs and their interests were central, right? We were investing in their activities and their lessons and their sports and all of their potential from a very young age. And a lot of time and money and resources were going to them as children, whereas Gen X and before, that was not the case. We were very much supporting actors to a family that revolved around adults. And it's not bad or good, it's just different. And what happens then is when young people then come to work, they're going to be much more forward about pushing on those walls because they've been encouraged to speak up and be proactive their whole lives, many of them. And so when they shake a load-bearing wall, one of the leadership approaches is to say, thanks for asking. I would love to talk about why we do it that way, or why that's really important here, or why in this industry we've done this for 100 years and we hope we are going to be doing that for 100 years more. They're not pushing to be disrespectful. They're pushing because they have grown up always having access to explanation and information, whether it's from parents or more likely from the internet, from social media, from Alexa. Like, why do we blank? Well, here's 10 explanations for that. So to go into an organization and have someone say, well, you don't need to worry about that. That's above your pay grade. That's not going to work anymore. And you might not like that, but that's the reality that we're in. And so instead saying, well, actually, I would love to explain to you why that's so important. Let's go have coffee and talk about it. So the load-bearing walls can stay the load-bearing walls, but we have to be willing to explain why they are, even if no one explained it to us. And then some of the walls they're going to push are going to be those like decorative 90s half walls, right? Like we built it in the 90s. We thought it was cute. And now we're just walking around it and nobody knows why there's half a wall there. And sometimes they'll push on things and say, why do we do it this way? Just like you did, right? When you shared your story, like, why are we still doing it this way? That doesn't even make any sense. And leaders have to be willing to say, well, let me think about that. Is that load bearing, or is that a half wall that's not probably serving us the way it did in the past? And if so, let's look into that. How would you do it? So that's kind of the metaphor I want everybody to keep in mind. And then the practices that we have developed. So we've been very much investing in the tools, the strategies, like, great, Megan, how do I actually do this? So we do have 4, and all of them are sort of to help you figure out which walls are being pushed on, and then how do we proceed from there? So the first one is what we call identifying or resisting assumptions. So this is, of course, being careful about bias. I think everyone understands that if we're using OK Boomer or those special snowflake Gen Zs. Like, that's bad. Please stop doing that. But I think the more interesting part of that first practice for me is how often are we assuming that we're having the same conversation with somebody that's an entirely different age and we're not. And so I found this in a lot of my work. So for example, a great one right now is professional. We need you to be more professional, right? You could say that to a younger employee, and you leave that conversation thinking, well, I told them they need to really work on being more professional. Well, how about asking instead, when I say professional, what does that mean to you? And I'm working on a piece right now on this because professional is subjective and it evolves, right? I found some fascinating insight on like professional etiquette from like the 80s. I was just interested. I found things that were like, if your client offers you cocaine, it is okay to politely decline. And it's like, oh my goodness. At one point, that was included in a office etiquette book in the 1980s. It's what I would call of its time, right? Just like all of these things where I'm like, wow, that is not what we talk about anymore. And so instead of assuming you saying be professional is going to be clear, it's like when I say professional, what does that mean to you? Like I had a great conversation with my niece and my son a couple weeks ago about phones. I wasn't telling them to put their phones away at the table, but I was telling them that like sometimes my students will say, well, where do I put my phone during a lunch meeting? And I'm like, I don't even understand that question. Like your phone should not be out during a lunch meeting. So, like where you should put it on the table is not the question. The question is, why is it out at all? But that didn't make sense to them. That seemed like a very odd quote rule to have. So I think the first practice is, and you can think of 1,000 different assumptions probably we're making about communication or dress or, you name it, transparency, right? So any term that you're throwing around and assuming that it means the same thing to you as it means to someone else, hot tip, that is probably not the case. So that's the first practice. The second practice is what we call adjusting the lens. This is where like, let's try to be curious, not judgmental. So anytime you get hit with a generational difference and you want to say like, are you kidding me right now? Like, what are they doing? Older or younger? Step back and see if you can instead get curious about why that might be happening. So Gentelligence, which is kind of the term that I use for all the work that I do, is about the why. Why would that person feel like it was important to call a client on the phone versus just sending them a text? Why are they insisting we come in to have that conversation instead of just doing a Zoom? And we give people what we call power questions. So if I want you to have smarter intergenerational conversations, what questions would allow you to do that? So like a question like, can you help me understand? Can you help me understand why it's so important to you that we meet in person? Or can you help me understand, why you don't want to use this existing system? The third practice then is how do we then start shifting to a place where we're building something better together than we could individually? Like, how do we get there? Like, one thing is to get rid of the tension, but then how do we tap into the opportunity? So the last two practices are really about that. So strengthening trust is the third practice. So because we're very aware of generational judgment, what we have are a lot of workplaces where people are holding back, either because they don't want to be perceived as a boomer or they don't want to be perceived as entitled. And so we're not necessarily getting everyone's best ideas or insights. Or on the flip of that, we're not getting people asking for help on things that they need to learn. So that might be an older employee who is happy to learn technology, but they're uncomfortable admitting they need help with it because they don't want to be called a boomer. Like nobody wants to be called a boomer or thought that they're, outdated. And so if your culture is such where people hesitate to ask for help, younger or older, then we're missing some potential there. We want to normalize somebody saying, you know, well, I feel like AI would be an amazing thing to help me streamline this horribly, redundant task, but I am not sure how to get started. Would somebody be willing to help me with that? I ask in my classroom every day, and I'm sure your daughter can attest to this. Like, I have no shame being like, why is this not working? Like, why do we have no sound on this video? And like, somebody will hop up and like push or whatever I'm supposed to be pushing. And they don't respect you less because you're asking for help. They respect you more because you're not pretending that you know everything. I think that's like one of the biggest lessons is that younger or older, older to younger, people love to be asked for help and expertise. And so we need to normalize that. And then the last one is all about, we call it expanding the pie, but it's really just how do we turn it into a win-win? Like, how could what you know and what I know blend together to come up with a new solution to a hard problem? So, for example, in my classroom now, the first day of every semester, I sit down with my students and I say, so what are we going to do about AI? Because I don't actually know what the right policy is or what, like, should I be okay with you using it? When should I not be? So I'll just say, like, if you were me, what kind of AI policy would you create? And I'm not going to necessarily do that, but I'm really interested because they'll share things with me about how it's helping them learn or how it's not good or how it's backfired and then we just have this great dialogue where not only do they feel respected and engaged and part of the conversation, but they're much more willing to listen to my insights or mentoring or experience if I've first asked for theirs, which is just kind of leadership 101. But I think when it comes to age, we sort of forget that. Because I could say to them, well, that's fascinating. I've learned a ton. I'd love to share from my perspective what I'm worried about or what I'm excited about, and then we can come up with something together that we're all much more likely to be on board with. So that's, not the short version, but those are just some examples of how we put those practices into effect.
Yeah, awesome. No, that's really good stuff. So I think a lot of that just comes down to collaboration, having a more collaborative approach to life and also respect. And I love what you're talking about as far as like millennials and the way that they were raised as a generation, many of them, not all of them, but just more in the center of the home, and that they're not being disrespectful talking to you the way that they might approach something. In the final chapter of your book, you were talking about, or chapter 8, I can't remember, you were talking about there was a construction company. So this is very close to our industry as far as looking for diesel mechanics or looking for even salespeople to understand that this is a great industry to attract people to. You can make a lot of money selling used trucks. You can make really good money as a diesel mechanic, and it's a very honorable trade. And as you spoke to earlier, that had been a little bit lost, like you said, this is our son and he was the first one, or this is our daughter and she was the first one in our family to go to college. And that was a badge of pride, really, in certain times. And not that it's not, I mean, it's still, definitely an accomplishment, but not the path for everybody. We need plumbers, we need people like that, and they can make a lot of money and a lot more money. In many cases, you got millionaire plumbers walking around.
Absolutely.
So it's not necessarily one of these skilled trades is not lucrative or, even an honorable profession to go into or something like that. And I think that bias is kind of disappearing.
I think so. And what I'm excited about is, my son's 19 and there's a lot of people in his age group that are figuring it out as all 19-year-olds try to do. And I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense that when someone is 17 or 18 or 19 years old, that we, expect them to figure out what they would like to do forever, and invest in, whether it's college or a major or something that might be, I don't know very many people who are doing what they majored in college anyway. Like, it's a developmental experience, just like apprenticing or all the other things that you would learn going to work in a family business. It's just a different developmental experience. And I love that for this age group, we're seeing more paths that are becoming socially acceptable. So the idea that, somebody choosing to, whether it's skilled trades or they want to get a certification in coding from Google, or they want to go to a 4-year school, like all of those things are becoming more socially acceptable. I think the pandemic, for better or for worse, it sort of reset things in terms of like taking a gap year, which is a very European thing to do, suddenly made more sense for people at that age group. It's like, I'm going to go work for a year and figure out what's next for me versus jumping immediately into college when maybe I'm not sure if that's what I want to do. Yep. I love that for them. I do think the other piece of this that we haven't really talked about is, this generation lives a very public existence. I see with my students what I call like the LinkedIn pressure cooker, where for them it's like, I'm excited to announce I've taken a job at blank, or I have an internship this summer at blank. And all these announcements come out a couple times a year around career fairs and things like that. And if you don't have a job, right, you feel so stressed and so awful because you're getting hit with all of these announcements that other people have found this level of success. I think probably for younger people, it's more on social media like Instagram, or where they're seeing what their peers are doing, whether they're choosing a college or they're whatever they're doing. So that last chapter in our book, what I loved about that company was their founder wanted to make this generation understand that construction was cool. Mm-hmm. And their company specifically was a media company, bringing social media and media coverage to an industry that traditionally hadn't really been interested in that. Publicizing your secrets of your trade was not something that many construction industries were interested in doing. And so, the more you can normalize, right? Like when you think like, how do you get people to feel like this industry is desirable or a great path? I'm sure you've seen them. There's channels and videos about, people trimming horse hooves and, like all of these things. And like, they're mesmerizing because it's like, this is someone's job. And to sort of be willing to share out, or maybe encourage younger employees to share how cool their job is, or how profitable, or how independent they can be, or a cool thing about their industry that people might not know. I think the threat of social media is, well, I don't know if it's cool to post that I work at a used semi dealership. It's like, well, let's make it cool, right? Like it could become like, if suddenly people learn that there's all these opportunities and ability to be your own boss and all of the, like all the things that are involved, let's shine a light on that and turn it into something that's a positive. And that's the upside of living such a public life, is that's like, come to work with me today and let me show you the cool stuff that I get to do and think about. I just think it's education, and it's a different way to show like the path and the different ways that success can be defined.
Yeah, I think that's very unique, and definitely truck sales is cool. So
yeah, I have no doubt. I have no doubt.
Yeah. It was fun for me growing up around trucks and climbing all over them. I mean, and, you take any guy out there and, little kid, they're going to be driving around some kind of a truck, and then they're going to be playing with their, little loaders and all that stuff in the sandbox, and they just get bigger as you get older. They don't, that never goes away. So
right? Yeah,
it's always fun to play with. And a lot of ladies in our industry now too. I mean, I've been paying attention to that side of it too. And it's pretty cool to see the changes in our industry and just the growth I think that we've had, and it's pretty incredible. So so I think for the dealerships, you've given them some pretty good information on. I mean, I think that last bit was really good as far as trying to attract the younger generations. They're not going to want the PowerPoint presentations and the paper brochures. They're going to want to consume things on social media or Instagram or something like that, and just see people being authentic. And I think that's a big part of what Gentelligence is about, or becoming about, maybe, is just being authentic with people. Again, respectful, and all those positive character traits, I think, come out in Gentelligence, which is really attractive to me, because that's with multi-generational family involved with this business that I have. And it's been also pretty cool for me, Megan, because I've been able to, just because of my age group, and just when I came into the business, we had all of my father's friends that I was friends with, and then I was also friends with the younger generation, younger than me. Eventually, I was the youngest for a long time, and then that's kind of shifted. Now I'm more in the middle, and it's pretty interesting to see just how different people think. But our industry is pretty collaborative, and so I have to say that a lot of voices are heard. So I'm going to tip my hat to our industry just a little bit that way. Not that there's not room for improvement, and I'm glad people are getting to hear this today. So any wrap ups or big takeaways that we didn't cover on this? I think we've had a lot of really, really great topics, but anything jumping out to you?
I think the way that people get on board with Gentelligence and any kind of, sort of shift in how we think about difference is you have to really have a personal experience where you benefit from it. That's just life. And I was lucky enough early in my career to realize that being open to learning and the perspectives of people both older and younger was making me better at my job. It made me a better teacher to understand the way my students were thinking. And also to learn from the lessons that my older colleagues had already gone through and learned. And so when you think about it that way, right, how could you benefit from being open to the input and perspective of people significantly older or younger? Whether it's just, wow, our business will be more successful, or I might learn something, or I, will be able to even, the power of mentors, like we talk about mutual mentorship, friendship in the workplace. Being friends with people in the workplace who are significantly older or younger is rare, but incredibly valuable, because there's not that competition of, well, where are they at in their career? That's off the table. And if they're older, they've already been through a lot of the things in life that you're navigating, maybe at a very different time. And if they're younger, they can give you the opportunity to maybe understand the way norms have shifted. And when I see these kinds of connections in the workplace, I've worked to help companies set up mutual mentoring programs. And what I hear over and over again is, well, I didn't think that we would become friends. We've had so much in common. And that's the thing that I think gets missed, is we have a lot of common ground in terms of what we need and what we hope for out of work and out of life. The needs are the same, the norms are different. And so when we focus just on the norms, we often judge and misinterpret those underlying common areas that actually are a great place to build from. So, I think it's just that openness of trying to really look at these differences, not as purely aggravating, but also as potentially really beneficial and an opportunity. So I think that's how I'd want to wrap it up.
Yeah, I love that. One last thing. I had down here that Gen X is the best generation. Can you explain that a little bit deeper, maybe? How do we get to that?
Yes. Well, I champion all generations, just to be clear. I think no one really hears a lot about Gen X, which of course is a sad, sad thing. Gen X is the smallest generation. So, I think we are pretty big in the workplace right now, not quite as big as millennials, but one of the things maybe I'll say about Gen X in our favor is Gen X is actually least intimidated by artificial intelligence. I saw data on that a few
Hmm.
months ago, and that gave me pause because, of course, I would have thought it would have been Gen Z. But then when I realized, I think that comes from the fact that the internet was invented as we were growing up, and some older Gen Xers were early career. I was mid school, and that was as much of a game changer, if not more, than what we're experiencing right now. And we had to just sort of roll with it.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, that's true. Baby boomers had that experience, but later in their life, and millennials had it younger in their life. But for Gen X, it's like, oh, is this what we're doing now? Okay, I guess I'll still have a job. I just have to figure out how to use this, right? And so I thought that was really interesting because now, as this game changing technology is sort of terrifying everyone, Gen X, the norm there is like, all right, like, I guess we'll just figure it out, I guess this is what we're doing. So I don't know. I think there is a certain sort of, I just have a love for the Gen X mentality of like, all right, well, we'll just sort of roll with it and figure it out. I think that's always going to have a special place for me. I do love my generation. So
Yeah, our generation. So I
our
love
generation, yeah.
it. Yep. No, yeah, so the last thing you were talking about before I took us off on the Gen X tangent was the Gentelligence. Being Gentelligence is kind of a superpower if you look at it in a certain way. So I think
Agreed.
yeah, because you can gain a lot from it. And so I think for the viewers today, everybody listening today, I'd like to first of all thank Megan for being on today with us. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you on today. So thank you for that. And as far as everything else goes, Megan, how can they reach out to you? I know that you have an Instagram page, some other things like that in your book. So can you give a quick little?
Sure. Probably the best way. So, gentelligence.org is our webpage. So, that's got all of the resources, articles, link to the book, link to the training, all of those good things. LinkedIn is also great. So, if people are on LinkedIn, I try to post interesting articles, things that are coming up, podcasts, for example, like where we have a great conversation. So, I would say gentelligence.org. We have a newsletter you can sign up for where you can get all those power questions I told you about as well. And then LinkedIn, probably the best.
Yep. Fantastic. So, well, I hope everybody got something out of today. And yep, go buy the book and check out the LinkedIn and Instagram pages. She's got some great material up there. I've been there, and yep, like, follow, and otherwise, uh, yep, support
Yeah.
Megan and look at her material. Other than that, I hope you guys have found something that helps you get those trucks off the lot and over the curb.